Hello. Today I want to talk a little bit about international trade with externalities. Basic economic theory tells us that the nation will be better off if we have free trade. That is, any kind of import tariff or an export subsidy or an export tax will reduce national welfare. At the same time, we often read in the newspapers that an import tariff is actually going to make the country better off. So how can we square these two things? Economic theory says that import tariffs make us worse off, and the media are often telling us that we're actually going to be better off. Well, there are several answers to that, but they all go back to market failures. So if there is a market failure, we know that a domestic policy or a trade policy could potentially improve the welfare of the nation if we address the market failure. So today I just want to do one example. I'm going to be looking at a small country that is importing this good, computers, and we're going to assume that there is positive production externalities associated with producing computers. That is, if you produce computers at home within your own country, there's some technology spillovers that makes everybody else or all other industries in your country more productive and therefore increases national welfare. Now normally we would show that on a diagram like this by drawing a marginal social cost curve that is below the marginal private cost. So if this was marginal private cost, the marginal social cost curve would go somewhere, maybe you draw it something like this underneath here. And that's one way to do it. And we know that if you do it that way, we can determine what the optimal policy response from the government would be, something that would internalize the externality and make firms act accordingly. Now, when we do international trade, drawing that marginal social cost curve below makes it actually kind of messy. So what I'm going to do today is just going to draw that curve in this diagram down here instead. So let's just assume that the marginal external benefit from domestic production is constant, just like this. And so what we have here, of course, is that before we do anything, this country is importing goods. We can see how much. Domestically, they're producing right there, and their domestic consumers are consuming right there. And the difference is, of course, imports here. But this domestic production that we have over here is actually leading to some external benefits associated with that production. That is the technology spillover that goes to other industries and making them slightly more productive. We can see that if we could somehow convince these domestic producers to produce more, the marginal external benefit, which is constant, would lead to greater total external benefits in the entire country. And that's going to be the main intuition here. So I'm going to start with a domestic policy, which is just a production subsidy. If you put a production subsidy in this market, naturally producers who are subsidized will produce more output. And the way we show that is that the subsidy will reduce the marginal private cost. So I'm just going to draw in a subsidy line right here, something like this. And you can see then that with this production subsidy, producers will produce this much more output, and that's going to lead to an increase in external benefit from domestic production. But we want to do some kind of welfare analysis to see whether this is a good idea or a bad idea for the entire country, which is what we're focusing on here. All right, so in order to do that, we have to think about what happens to prices and quantities. Well, let's just start from the beginning. If the government gives the producers a subsidy, clearly producers would like to produce more output. There's an increase in output and production. Now normally, when domestic producers increase production, that's going to create a domestic surplus, right? And that domestic surplus would normally reduce prices. However, when we have international trade, and they face these terms of trade, this is their international price, what happens is that instead of the increase in output leading to a domestic surplus, all we're doing is just reduce imports. So imports are reduced to these many imports instead. And because there is no domestic surplus, there will be no change in the domestic price facing consumers. So what we're going to have here is that consumers will still pay exactly the same price as they always did. I'm writing PC here. But producers, they will receive PC or the terms of trade when they sell the good, but then the government is going to give them a subsidy which is equal to this much, and therefore the price that producers receive is actually greater than what the price is that consumers pay. All right, so if we want to do some welfare analysis, I would go ahead and put some areas here. So A and B will be the two areas we see over here. And then I'm going to just put the area E down here because that's going to represent the increase in external benefits from domestic production. Now, if we go ahead and do some welfare analysis over here, we can see that what happens to consumer surplus, first of all? Well, consumers are still paying the terms of trade. They're still consuming exactly the same. Let's say that's QC0. They're still consuming exactly the same output as they did before. And since there's no change in price or quantity, there's no impact on consumer surplus. So consumer surplus is going to be unchanged. Of course, producers are better off. That is the whole point of this one. Producers will receive a higher price and they will consume a greater quantity. So instead of QP0, they will produce QP1 over here. And that benefit, if we look at that, the area above the supply curve below the new price, we can see that producers will gain the area A. Now that increase in producer surplus is not free because the government would have to subsidize them. So the government is going to have to pay out the subsidy multiplied by how much they are producing. And that turns out to be that rectangle there, which is an expenditure. So I put a minus sign there of A and B. Now, if we didn't have any externality here, you can see that this country will be worse off, and the deadweight loss would be minus B. But now, because when they increase the production, you actually have an increase in external benefits, so I'm going to have to add E to the benefits to this nation. And now if I go ahead and do what the impact is on total surplus, I get minus B, that's the production distortion cost, plus E, which is the improved welfare due to the external benefits from technology spillovers. And what we see here, that if we have a market failure, it is actually better, or it can be better for the country if we imposes a production subsidy. All right, so since this is about trade, let's think about whether or not there is a trade policy that could also make this country better off. It's an importing nation, and we want to encourage domestic production, so the obvious policy choice is going to be an import tariff. An import tariff, as it turns out, is actually made up of two domestic policies. An import tariff is one, a production subsidy, because producers will produce more, and a consumption tax, because consumers will consume less. Now, if I want to compare the production subsidy to the import tariff, I just have to make sure that the change in production from QP0 to QP1 is exactly the same. And it turns out that this will be true if I make the import tariff equally high, or a tariff that increases the price in this nation to equal PP in the former case. All right, so let's think about prices here. When you have an import tariff, the first effect is, of course, that foreign-produced goods become more expensive. When foreign-produced goods become more expensive, consumers will switch over to wanting to buy domestically produced goods. However, they want to buy a lot more than producers are actually producing, so you're going to have a domestic shortage. That domestic shortage will make the domestic producers increase their prices, and they will continue increasing their prices until the shortage is gone, which happens, again, at this point where the price with the tariff is equal to the price that we had before with the production subsidy. So here we see that there's going to be a lot of, the impact on producers is going to be very similar, but importantly, with the import tariff, consumers will now consume fewer goods. We're going to have this QC1 here, and they're going to have to pay a higher price, which is this price over here. So I'm going to write just P over here now. So what we have here with the import tariff is that the consumers and the domestic producers both face a higher price, something higher than the terms of trade that they faced in the beginning of before the tariff. All right, so what I'm going to do here is just put some, label a few more areas. I'm going to get rid of this production subsidy line just to make it a little bit clearer. And I'm going to call this area C, and I'm going to call this area D. All right, so now we want to do welfare analysis with an import tariff. Now there will clearly be an impact on consumers because the consumers are now paying a higher price and they're consuming fewer goods, and therefore the loss in consumer surplus will be this area below the demand curve and above the new price. So they lose A, B, C, and D. Producers are better off. They can charge a higher price and they sell more goods. So once again, because we're trying to make these two equivalent, they get A just like they did before. The government are now collecting revenue not from domestic production but from the imports. So whatever a tariff is, you're going to multiply that by the number of imports. So we have this new rectangular area there, which is plus C. This is the revenue that the government collects from the import tariff. Again, if there was no market failure, we would just stop here and we could just look, and there's, minus B and minus D would be the deadweight loss. But here we actually have an additional benefit from the positive production externality, which is E. So once again, I'm going to have to add that to our welfare analysis. And now if I do it, A crosses out, C crosses out, so I have minus B, D, plus E. All right, so we can now see something really, really interesting. First of all, we want to note this here is that it is possible that the import tariff is making or makes this country better off. That it is possible that this area E offsets or even outweigh the production distortion cost and the consumption distortion cost. So the deadweight loss that comes from an import tariff could be offset by the terms, by the external benefits from domestic production. That's the first thing that we notice. We also notice, however, that if the import tariff made a country better off, then the production subsidy would make the country even better off. That if the production subsidy only has a production distortion cost, this B, and there is no consumption distortion cost, which is that D. So what we would have to conclude is that an import tariff can make the country better off, but only in a second best kind of sense. Because there is always a domestic policy, in this case the production subsidy, that is first best. That is, production subsidy can make the country achieve the same kind of external benefits, but at a lower cost in terms of efficiency. So because the production subsidy doesn't affect the consumers, we don't have a consumption distortion cost. All right, so that's actually all I want to say. So just make sure that we realize that import tariffs can make the country better off, but they are not the best way of doing so. It's always better to use a production subsidy, in this case, that is a domestic policy. So once again, we have seen a government policy that can make the country better off if it's able to offset a market failure. But the rule still holds that you want to address the market failure at its source, and that's what a domestic policy will do when you have a domestic market failure.